Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. I'm your host, Victoria Gugenheim, and this is a very special bonus episode of our Men for Equality series, featuring Rob Jessel. The themes here are going to deal with male prostitution, violence, grooming, and sexual exploitation, as well as references to the BDSM scene, so listener discretion is advised. All events discussed here are alleged. Rob is a writer, mostly on financial technology, and also is a campaigner for LGBT rights. Back in 2018, he co-founded Fair Cop, which highlights police abuse of powers over free speech, and his first book, co-authored with Joe Bartosh, is due to be published in October by Polity Press. We're very lucky to have you. Welcome, Rob.
Hi, Victoria. Thanks very much for having me.
You're very welcome. Today, we're going to dive into something which is obviously quite personal to you. So we're going to be talking about your experiences as a sexual abuse and prostitution survivor. People don't seem to realize how much this actually affects men. So I'm really delighted you can join us. Can you tell me the start of your story so we can kind of get into it and go from there?
Sure. I suppose it makes sense to start with school. I went to an idyllic prep school in the Cotswold Hills in an old converted country house, and it was all very sort of special and magical and Harry Potter. And it made me feel very grown up because once a week we'd have a guest speaker and the boys would put on their best jackets and ties and stuff. We'd listen to the speaker and then there'd be a candlelit dinner and the older boys were allowed a glass of wine. Just the sort of thing that any parent nowadays would look back on and see multiple red flags, especially as the school's owner, the person who set it up and had appointed himself headmaster, was, shall we say, a single bachelor.
Yes.
This was the late 80s, early 90s, I would say. It was a slightly more innocent age, or perhaps, but yeah, I fell completely under the spell of the school and also under the spell of this particular man, and obviously didn't realize until much later, but the particular interest that he showed me was a long process of grooming that resulted in multiple rapes towards the end of my schooling there, so around about the age of 13.
Wow.
And my experience for me, and I'm very careful to say that I don't speak for others, for other men or anyone else, I only really speak for myself, but it wasn't until much later that I came to see it as abuse. It wasn't until much later after that I began to think about it and talk about it as rape. At the time, you feel very special, very grown up.
Yeah.
And that's lavished upon you, especially if you're quite a troubled kid, which I was. I could have been thrown out of that school many times for all sorts of things, theft, misbehavior and so forth. But the headmaster always found a way to keep me in. And something that I've said to a partner in the past, which disturbed them, was that the process of grooming feels really good. And it's supposed to feel good, because if it makes you feel uncomfortable, then it's not really working there.
Yeah.
So I think that's affected me and changed me in ways that probably will take a lifetime to work out how. As one gets older and learns more about oneself and is aware of that, it's important not to define yourself by abuse, but it's also important to keep an eye out for, I react in a certain way to these situations because of, or the reason I feel this way has its roots in. So it's a tricky balancing act, which is also why I feel that there's no particularly good word in my mind for people who have experienced or who have suffered grooming and sexual abuse. A lot of people don't like the word victim because they don't like to be defined by it. A lot of people have problems with the word survivor for other reasons. And to my mind, one of the problems about talking about this is to find a word that sort of straddles that. And I would love to know what your thoughts were.
That's a very interesting question, actually. I do think there is a false dichotomy with victim and survivor because it places you in one camp or the other. And sometimes there's multiple things that can happen where people 6, 7, 8, 9 times to leave an abusive situation if they've been groomed or gaslit. Maybe an abuse endurer perhaps would be something that's better rather than victim or survivor, because it is an endurance to do that, especially if the grooming process is long and detailed and you don't know what's happening. Because from my side as well, I've been groomed and I know what it's like. So I feel like if you've endured that, I'd say someone who's endured that abuse is probably a technically better term, even though it's still clunky, just because I feel like if you've survived it, there's also this thing where some people take pride in the term survivor, and rightly, especially if you've gone through it and you have survived and come out the other end. But also there's this danger where that then becomes your entire life. So you just frame yourself only as a survivor of abuse, and then there's no growth, then there's no way of getting the rest of your personhood in there. So in some way the actual grooming has still won if you're using that framing and that terminology. So I think if you've endured it, then that's probably in the ballpark of potentially that being a more accurate term.
I think that that's a very good sort of in microcosm, an example of the complexities. And when people think about sexual abuse or indeed any other forms of abuse and the difficulties that it gives you for the rest of your life, people tend to think about sort of anxiety and depression, suicide, ideation, addiction, and so forth. And those are all
Yeah.
true. But quite often it's just the small things like finding the right words. And sometimes it's the problems are quite small, but also quite big at the same time. It's just very complex and very confusing. I would say the biggest damage that it's done to me that I'm aware of is great confusion over many aspects of my life, from sexuality to language.
I can understand that, because there is something where if you've survived something like this, you do wonder where your abuser's sexuality ends and when your sexuality begins. Because you're going, what have I got from my abuser? What's my actual bodily autonomy? What do I actually enjoy sexually? It feels like, from my perspective anyway, I'm not sure what your experience was like. We can get into that a bit later if you like. But the psychological term is called introjection, where you take on the belief systems of your abuser or the behaviors of your abuser. And I think that happens a lot with grooming endurers / survivors. You are taught and molded into what the person who's abusing you actually wants from you, rather than you actually autonomously discovering yourself. So I think that's where a lot of the confusion happens when you've gone through this and you're going, actually, what am I left with? Where's my sense of personhood? Where's my sense of wanting to be sexually autonomous? What do I actually enjoy? You've also, I think, compounded with that, sometimes you get things like flashbacks, which can happen quite a lot. And it can be the most innocuous things. So it could be a knock on the door that then brings back abusers knocking on the door to be let in. So you have that kind of confusion and those flashbacks mixed with wanting to have some kind of sexual autonomy and not quite understanding where the introjection is and where you are. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I don't know whether I have flashbacks or not, because I suppose the term flashback in our sort of very visual culture, one thinks of a flashback as the actual image of the abuse, of where you were, comes back to the mind's eye. And I don't get that at all, really. And I can think about the abuse and put myself in that situation and to be that kid again. But at the same time, sometimes when I revisit things, or when I know, for example, that I've got to give testimony to the Independent Inquiry on Child Sexual Abuse, when I'm about to do one of those things, or when I have done them, my friends and those close to me do notice a change in me that I don't really see myself. I'm irritable and very stressed, very anxious and all this. And they're like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I'll genuinely say, I'm fine. And I don't realize that stress of whether it's because I'm revisiting something in my past, or whether it's because I'm anxious, because it's usually because I'm about to do something I'm about to do, like this podcast, say, and I want to give it a really good go, or want to warn parents, say. I don't know whether that counts as flashback, but that's how I would say the abuse really wells up and begins to have a really, when I say noticeable effect on my life, it's noticeable in retrospect when friends have said it's quite clearly this.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, because it tallies with, have you read The Body Keeps the Score?
I have, and that's great.
Yeah. And so I think this sounds like it's a manifestation of that, where if it is in your body and you're being brought back to the site of your abuse, if you like, that this is going to have a very clear toll on you. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why you're getting these stress responses, because it's not stored in the body like a book. It's patterns that you've got and you've accumulated. And being around things which can trigger you, ensuring that even though you're doing stuff like this, you can't always ensure yourself, you can't always calm yourself down. There'll always be stress responses. So I think it's very much on the side of the body keeps the score, to my mind, you know?
No, it's a very good book, and I would recommend that to anyone who wants to understand what it's like for somebody, to use your word, and it's a great word, who has endured abuse of any sort.
Brilliant. Well, we can pop that in the notes as well, because I also wholeheartedly endorse the book. Getting back to your story, you said about creating fake IDs to get things like razzle mags out of curiosity. So was this something that was happening while the grooming was taking place and you were also going through your own puberty, obviously? Or was this something that was part of the grooming for you? Can you take us through that?
Yeah, I would say it's important to put a sort of a separation between the abuse, because the abuse it's important to recognize the grooming as an equal, if not greater part of the abuse than the actual sex is.
Definitely, 100%.
And a lot of people won't like the word sex, so they should call it rape. But I'm apologise for those whom that word is abhorrent to talk about. That kind of abuse of children by adults. But that all happened in the run-up to me leaving prep school and joining big school. So it's almost while all the other kids are working towards the exams and about to take a major step into, adulthood or into their adolescence in preparation for adulthood when they leave big school, I was doing all of that. And yet I'd already jumped adolescence, say, and joined a major part of the adult world by having an adult man's tongue in my mouth and much, much more. Then I went to big school, and I would say that I didn't think about it very much. I didn't define my sexuality in any way. I wasn't particularly conscious of it. But I think it's important when we're talking about making really bad quality fake IDs to try and go and get a jazz mag from the newsagents, that I'd actually been, looking back on it, groomed a little bit before that. When you're joining one of these sort of old public schools, obviously the young kids have to go through initiation processes where they get humiliated and have to drink disgusting concoctions and get hosed down and beaten, and in some cases branded, which is what happened to one boy in our year.
Oh my God.
And one part of the initiation routine was to be shown a pornographic magazine and have to identify parts of the vulva. And the point of this is, like, 13-year-old kids won't know any of this, and the older kids can laugh at their sexual inexperience. And so that was the first time I'd seen naked ladies. This was the early 90s. This was long before the internet and tube sites and so forth. So that very much normalized the idea that women were basically things to be pointed at and laughed at and used. And remember that I'm growing up in an all-male environment at prep school and then an all-male environment at public school. So pornography, I wouldn't say it became normalized, because there wasn't a lot of this material going about. You had to go out and hunt it out in hedgerows or pluck up the courage to go to newsagents and buy it. And I think I was successful once or twice. I didn't connect that what I was looking at was effectively the same type of abuse that I had been subjected to a year or two before. In fact, it's only much, much later in life that I've come to appreciate that.
Wow. How does that make you feel? Because it seems the entire environment that you were in was really toxic and just grooming by default. Actually coming to the understanding of that is quite a bombshell. So how do you feel about all of this? It seems like a whole perfect storm to me.
I didn't really have anything else on which to base it. I didn't have any other models. When you're away from home and you're away from role models and the advice of parents and guardians, and when you're in an environment where the boys do manage themselves, it is a little bit Lord of the Flies.
Oh, I can imagine.
It is sink or swim. And unfortunately, boys left to their own devices and without the influence of girls and women, I don't think that's particularly healthy. When I look back, I think I was just trying to fit in. I think most of my life up until my mid-teens was really desperately just trying to be like others, and you're really failing at it. I suppose looking back on it now, I regret that, but I just think of it as a And you've got to be careful with this word, but I mean it in its real sense. It's a retardation. It retards you emotionally, socially, and in some degrees intellectually as well. And I see it as just a missed opportunity to grow. And I look at people who went to co-education schools and how, from a perspective of a sort of hormonal teenager, just looking with jealousy at how they were able to talk to girls. And the secret I now know is that it really helps if you treat them as human beings.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very malignant arrested development if you have an all-boys school or an all-girls school, because there's a real benefit to mixed sex education where you do actually have, obviously when things are switching on, you're able to actually start talking to the opposite sex, and they're not monsters and they're not dolls or playthings. They're not these weird effigies that boys and girls can have in their heads if they're not introduced to them at these formative years. You're able to develop these social skills. And you're right, there is real emotional and psychosocial retardation that happens if you're not engaging in your formative years. And I don't know if people actually catch up if they've been educated in these systems. I'd like to think there could be some way of catching up, but that is a really crucial element. At that time of your life, that's when your empathy centers are forming in your brain. If you don't have empathy for the opposite sex at that time, maybe you miss the crucial window and your empathy doesn't end up being fully developed. And that's something we really need to think about, especially now with contemporary porn use as well, because that's gotten under control. So that means there could be a really vital window that one misses.
Just on that point, I need to be very careful not to talk about my abuse or any forms of abuse and use the word gratitude alongside it. But I will say that in some ways it has protected me in that when I was using porn, I was instinctively repelled and put off by watching men and women. I tried to watch heterosexual porn. Not only did it not work for me, I was really appalled by it just because it was such a clear imbalance of power and it seems so fake.
Right.
I thought, this is not, can't even imagine this is true. The power imbalance is too obvious. I don't know much about women, but I bet she doesn't like that. And it's really treating her like she's an object and stuff. So that sort of turned me completely off het porn. And I suppose that probably saved me from doing a lot of damage to my relationships with my friends. Who knows? I could have gone down the route of being an obscenely misogynistic gay man who completely discounts women. There's a lot of fantastic gay men who are very supportive of women and have lots of friends, but unfortunately there is quite a large clique of gay men who find women repellent and repugnant, and who knows that I might have been one of them if I dabbled more in het porn.
That's actually a really interesting point. I think it's quite indicative of you knowing your sexuality very early if you were that level of repulsed. So if you can see the power imbalance, why cannot the rest of the world see the blatantly obvious power imbalance in mainstream pornography? People are going, oh no, it's fine, absolutely, these women totally enjoy it. And the work of Gail Dines, it's very clear. These women's bodies, they don't last. They're in the industry 2 or 3 months and then they're so broken they have to leave. And then people just have this, I don't know, it's like the Douglas Adams not my problem shield from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It just doesn't faze them. They just don't think about it. It's just seen as entertainment for them rather than there being a real person there that's actually getting pain and suffering inflicted on them. To me, that beggars belief.
This is just quite a minor point, but just for the record, I should make clear that I don't describe myself as gay. And when you say that you knew your sexuality quite early, I would say I'm in my mid-40s now and I still don't really know.
Well, that's okay. It's okay not to know. I only found out I was a leser about 3 years ago, so that was news to me. Yeah. And yeah, so until then I was just there going, I think there's something wrong, but I'm not sure. And then it just hit me like a ton of gay bricks. It takes a while to find out sometimes, and that's okay.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
So you were saying that after this grooming, you then got into prostitution. Do you want to talk about how you were propelled into that?
Sure. So it happened in the second year of uni and the first year when I was living on my own. And I think that's quite, because I've had to think about it, because we've had a few weeks between our first chat and this recording. And I realized that all the sort of, not safeguards, all the sort of support networks that one has and one builds when you are suddenly entering the adult world fully for your own time. Because I think halls of residence is still like supported living, really. You're not truly independent. You're surrounded with your friends and stuff. For me, when I was on my own, living in a really dreary, dank basement in Brixton with mold on the walls and bars on the windows, and I was expected to organise my own life and my own emotions and go to college and do work and stuff, it all very quickly spiraled into panic and anxiety, which means you don't go to college, which means you get behind on things, which means you drink and smoke weed, and that it just spirals and gets worse and worse. And I was reading one of the gay mags, I can't remember if it was Boys or Gay Times, and I was flicking through the ads at the back, and there was an advert for an escort agency, and I didn't really know what an escort was, but I could work it out from context. And I thought, just when your mind is really quite ill and when you're quite vulnerable and some really stupid ideas sometimes seem to be like the smartest thing ever, I thought, gosh, I could have sex and get paid for it. In spite of having sex very early, I was a very inexperienced young man. I'd fooled around, I'd done this and that, I'd never had a boyfriend or a lasting relationship. So it was almost like a curiosity to actually have lots of sex and have lots of money too. So I was drawn to it and I romanticized it a bit in my mind, but to be honest, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And I'm quite an impulsive person anyway. It was just a perfect environmental and psychological storm that happened to coincide with me leafing through some small ads. So I called the number and arranged to meet the pimp.
Wow. You were telling me that you were quite impressionable and you just wanted to go straight in, and that it was very hazy for you at the time as well. There was some dissociation that was happening when you were doing it. And I remember when we were talking originally, you were talking about there was the process of being interviewed for the job, which was quote unquote job, which was really shocking. So can you take us through that?
Yeah, the address that I was given was a flat in Pimlico, and I climbed the stairs and went in, and it was faded gentry type furniture type stuff, and I just remember this sort of rather seedy posh man who interviewed me, and again, it's quite hazy, I don't remember much about it. I remember him asking me if I was versatile, and I was so innocent that I didn't really know what it meant, and he had to explain it to me. Then he ordered me to strip, and I saw that as a test. Am I going to be nervous about it? And my whole thought was I must put on a good performance for him. I must want him to like me and choose me, which has been a problem for me my whole life, that sort of wanting to be liked and wanting to please others. So I stripped, and he handled the goods, shall we say, and he was very pleased that I became aroused very quickly. And my whole worry at the time, because I was self-harming a lot at that time and my scars were very fresh. They weren't even scars, they were wounds. And I thought that when I undressed, I thought, have I put my hands behind my back fast enough? Because if he sees those, he won't want to choose such damaged goods, and what kind of clients is going to want that? And I thought I got away with it, but looking back on it, I think he probably saw those and thought that's going to be attractive to a certain type of client.
Oh my
and I believe it probably was.
Wow. I remember you saying about this that you felt like a horse in a meat market when he was doing this to you.
Yeah, he didn't look at my teeth. Yeah, no, he was more interested in other qualities, yeah.
Wow. This is a really important point because clearly the whole element here is just seeing you as meat and dehumanizing you and seeing where you would be best pushed out to in terms of people who would want to abuse you. There's a dehumanization that happens in prostitution. This really brings that home. If you're that level of dehumanized, the first time you encounter it, that's just shocking. Just how someone could just treat you like that on the first time meeting you.
As an aside, a partner of mine once said, there's no middle ground with you. You're either brilliant, the best in the world at this, Mr. Cool, the king, or you're a worthless piece of shit who's useless at everything and everyone hates. And that's been explained to me by others is when you have feelings of incredible sort of worthlessness and self-hatred and disgust, the ego quite often counterbalances that as a survival technique.
Yes.
And the only way that it can do that is by going to the opposite extreme. So there's a sort of bipolarity. Please say
Bipolarity. There we go.
yes,
Bipolarity.
here we go. Between one's emotions and one's sense of self. And I'm sure that experiences of abuse and prostitution must have a hand in that.
I would say so. That's a type of splitting as well. If you think of yourself as amazing or thinking of yourself as terrible, there's no consilience of the self. Once you realize that, you can work on that and work on seeing yourself as someone who is just a normal human being with benefits and flaws like everybody else, but it does take an awful lot of work. It takes a while for you to start reintegrating and grounding yourself. And one of the things, actually, getting back to the grooming element of this, that idea of wanting to please someone and thinking, oh my God, have I pleased someone? Have I done a good enough job? Have I stood to attention? That is all indicative of the grooming behavior, which makes you feel good, but then devalues you as a person. It can't not devalue you as a person because it's taking away your sense of self for the sake of somebody else. That whole idea of splitting, I think, is actually tied in to wanting to please somebody, because either you're the best person in the world to do it, or you're such a piece of shit they're going to do whatever they want to you. I think it's something that a lot of people who, if they've been in the sex trade, they deal with a lot of feelings of worthlessness and feelings of, are they ever going to be good enough? And the ego will always kind of, I think, take over a bit, just as, like you said, as a self-defense. And there needs to be more outreach for male survivors of prostitution or male endurers of prostitution. If that's really pronounced, it can be easier for women to get help. But if a guy wants to, there's still this whole ridiculous idea, this like ridiculously sexist idea that a guy just has to be macho and just deal with it. And, oh, he got free sex, so that's amazing. Or he got paid for sex, how brilliant is that? And no, you can still be hideously abused if you're male, and you have every right to get the care and consideration and help that you need in order to process what's happened to you. And that should just be a basic human right, I think, just to recover from abuse and trauma like that. I remember you saying when we were talking the first time about the first client that you were given after this interview. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I remember exactly where it was. It was in Wapping, and I remember having to get my little pocket A to Z to find out how to get there. This was back in the days when pretty much everybody carried a book of maps around with them, which may age me a bit. I was warned by the pimp. He said, I must warn you that he is rather grotesquely fat man, and he does like to play mind games. And I was like, well, in for a penny. And I remember thinking, well, that's my first job. I can't be drunk, but at the same time, there's absolutely no chance that I can be sober either. So I remember trying to strike quite a fine balancing act, and being however old I was, 19, probably getting it completely wrong, but I wasn't staggering drunk, and arriving and opening the door and having to put on a pleased face at this sort of very fat man. And there was very little sex and a lot of talking and a lot of manipulation and a lot of focusing on my injuries and my cuts and why do you do this to yourself? And it was almost Gladstonian in his sort of attempts to talk me out of this wicked, sinful life. I just saw it as a performance, really. I thought I was going to have to perform sex, but I realised that this was a different kind of performance, and it became a sort of psychological cat and mouse game, which was not what I expected. I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it, but it was a challenge. It was certainly something very different from what I'd spent the last few months doing, which is basically just drinking and smoking weed and panicking. It was, in a sense, it was actually quite experience, but a very dark one too. And I remember him saying, gosh, at your age, you shouldn't be doing this. And I remember saying, I know my own mind pretty well. And him scoffing and saying, yeah, 19, no one knows their own mind at that age. And looking back on it now, it's, well, yeah, you're probably right, mate. In which case, perhaps you shouldn't be.
Are you paying for me? Jesus, wow.
Yeah. I remember at the end, he gave me my money and he said, your wages of sin. To which I shot back, the wages of sin is death, which got a smirk from him. And I think I realised at the time that the pimp was trying to say, you really want to be a real prostitute? This is the sort of stuff that you've got to deal with. If you don't go through with it, if you don't do a good job, then I'm not going to pick up the phone to you again. So there was a sort of pressure there. I don't expect this to be particularly pleasant. Certainly didn't expect it to be that dark. But I got through it, and I presumably got a review. And again, this is long before people were posting stuff online. He would have made a phone call saying that he was a happy client, and I got more jobs.
How did you feel at the first time that you got paid? Because that guy sounds so deeply hypocritical. Oh, you shouldn't be doing this. Really? Well, why are you paying for him then? The level of mind games, the level of hypocrisy, it just beggars belief to me. So what was going through your mind after this happened?
I don't think I was applying normal, logical, rational standards to things. And that's partly because I just wasn't really in that frame of mind to think that way, but also because I felt that we were entering some sort of arena where everything's an act and everyone's pretending that they're not doing what they are actually doing. I'm pretending that I'm not selling my body. The other person pretends that they're not buying. We're all pretending that this is normal. We're all pretending that this is a normal part of gay male relationships. It's all make believe, it's all pretend. One of the few things I was good at school was acting. I was always in school play. I usually played like the villain, and it was something I really enjoyed. And I saw it as an extension of that, really. It was less about the sex and more about the acting. And I didn't do it for very long, but it was something that I saw as a performance. And I think I took much more pride in being who I was expected to be rather than doing well the acts that I had to do as part of that performance, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. That has a lot of parallels with the contemporary BDSM scene. There's things called acting out a scene. So there's a lot of performativity, there's a lot of acting, there's a lot of playing to the room. Looking back, it feels kind of perversely gladiatorial in a way, like you're in some kind of kinky coliseum. People are kind of baying for your blood in a way. And it has a lot of similarities with what you're describing, where there's a lot of wanting to appease, there's a lot of acting, there's a lot of performativity. There's so many parallels there. And of course, you do get paid mistresses and things like that in the scene too. You still have the putting on a show, playing a role, playing a persona. It's quite interesting, also quite sad, like the level of parallels that are there, and also that they're kind of happening at scale now across the world.
I would be very interested to know to what extent within prostitution these days that people are expected to engage in consensual non-consent, because this is something that I was pretty much unaware of before we started researching our book. And you can't really engage with modern pornography for any amount of time before coming up with the idea of CNC. So for those who don't know about it, and I'm sure most listeners do, this is acting out rape fantasies where you agree beforehand that you'll have a safe word when it can stop. But until you say that safe word, it's pretty much anything goes.
All over the BDSM scene too, by the way. And I had an encounter with that where it turned into a rape. It really is not safe.
That does not surprise me at all, sadly. And I would be curious, but also horrified to know whether people working in prostitution are being expected to provide CNC for their clients, because what we certainly see in other areas of porn, that very extreme niche sexual practices, they set young people's sexual scripts and their expectations.
Yeah.
Quite often before they've even had their first kiss. And so they are exposed to something that's very niche and something that takes, not that I endorse it in any way, choking or consensual non-consent or BDSM, but if it is practiced at all,
It is especially all over the brothel of Europe, Germany, they are doing extreme acts. So whether it's CNC, corporal punishment, whack, needle play, knives, all of that stuff, they are told to do that now. And the more extreme stuff is seen as being increasingly normalized. So I wouldn't say it's an endorsement at all. I'd say that this is just, if you want to know about it, Ellie Arrow, who's another host on Red Light Exposé, she does a lot of research into the statistics and prevalence of these things in prostitution. I don't have the statistics to hand, but I can say the extreme acts are no longer seen as extreme. They're seen as de rigueur now.
Okay. Yes, I've listened to quite a few episodes.
Maybe you can come back and have a conversation with Ellie Arrow as well. I'm sure that would be a fantastic and enlightening conversation.
Sure.
You're both very intellectual, and it would be a really fantastic conversation if you came back. We were talking about how you got into prostitution, and then you were saying that you got broken in really quickly as a result of this client, and you were pressed to do even more extreme things. So things like strangulation and spitting. So how did that come about for you?
Well, to be honest, I must say, though, that I feel like a bit of a fraud because I was always a bit of a dilettante within prostitution. I didn't do it for a very long period of time, I think 5 months at most. And most of my experiences were not abusive in the sense of the extremity of the acts that I was expected to do. It was only a few that sort of stand out as being quite odd for their time, perhaps less so now. So there was one client in Guildford who seemed really nice and said, look, I really like spitting in people's faces and being spat at. Are you okay with that? And a lot of more experienced people might have said, no, I'm sorry, you should have agreed that beforehand. But I just wanted to please and I didn't want to get fired. And so I did it and I felt it was weird and repulsive and demeaning and a little bit scary. It wasn't scary that I thought he would be violent with me. I felt a little bit scared to be with somebody who I considered so unhinged that they wanted to do that. I thought you would hire a prostitute because you wanted to enjoy the physical pleasure of somebody else's body, even if you knew that they weren't really into you. And I didn't understand how people could get enjoyment out of consciously degrading someone. But then again, I suppose there is no difference. Really, you're degrading somebody by buying them, by treating them as disposable, as an object. It's not even that I hadn't experienced spitting and being spat on. I wasn't even aware that this was an actual thing. So it all happens very fast and you have to get used to things very quickly. And again, this is where the acting came in. And yeah, you have to act like you're really into it. So that, I think that was quite unpleasant. But again, it was all in a day's work. And I can't remember what I felt as I got back on the train to London because, to be honest, this whole period of life is quite a blur, but just with very sharply defined snapshots at time, where the first big fat client was one, the spitting man in Guildford was another, and the guy who kept taking breaks to take mobile phone calls to run his language school empire was another. And the only one that I really remember clearly was where a very rich man who, for all I know, is very famous, had taken a suite at the Lanesborough, that really exclusive hotel in Hyde Park, and you have to go through all sorts of layers of security to get in there. And he hired two of us, and he basically asked us both to perform for him while he desultorily joined in, but mostly watched, and the television was on. And it was when the airliner crashed in New York a couple of months after 9/11. So that was on the news, and we were just watching it while performing. I shouldn't say this with any sense of amazement, but it's all quite seedy.
Yeah, I just can't imagine being in a situation like that where you've got the whole 9/11 thing going on in the background and this guy is just trying to get off to two of you pretending to get off.
It was like he was so rich that he could afford a really posh hotel, and this was in the days before multi-screening. So these days you might have a computer in the background playing porn, and he was ahead of his time in that me and this other guy were just another screen for him. We might as well be a sort of tableau vivant. So yeah, no, it's odd. You see how the 1% or maybe 2% of the 1% live.
Yeah, it must have been a real trial by fire as well, because you were just in this for a short amount of time, but you've condensed 2 years worth of experience into 5 months. So just the stuff you must have seen is just, it must be crazy. And I can really see the grooming elements coming in as well, like the constant need to please. The fact that's always there in the background, the idea that you just really want to please versus it being about your own sexual autonomy and agency, because clearly it isn't. If you're being bought, there's no way for you to truly have any sexual autonomy or agency in that situation because money is exchanged hands.
And also, you must remember that for a very inexperienced man like me, this was to a large degree setting and reinforcing whatever sexual scripts I had. My first script was set at the age of sort of 12, 13. Then there was the odd fumble with fellow pupils at school, but nothing particularly serious. And then pretty much straight into this world of really quite bizarre, at times, sex without love. I think we can concentrate on spitting and the strangulation and the much, much worse that a lot of people face, especially women too, because they are there physically as well as emotionally and psychological disadvantage.
I have to tell you as well, in terms of what female prostitutes are being told to do now, some have been made to jump from heights, and there is actually reports of a guy who uses prostitutes who enjoys pulling their teeth. So it's getting incredibly grim for women at the moment.
Which makes what I was going to say seem really quite trivial by comparison, but it's not really a trauma off.
No, not at all.
But for me, I think the most lasting thing is that really contributed to a process that had started about 8 or 9 years before, where sex and love become completely separate in one's mind. Like intellectually, you were aware that people fall in love and that they make love and that it's the highest expression of one's regard and fellow feelings for someone else. That's what it's supposed to be. But at the same time, you can't work out that you can't form relationships, long-term relationships. And when you're having sex with somebody, you're just having sex with them. You're not making love because, again, it's a performance and you're either trying to please the other person or you think this worked really well when, or the client really liked that. And you're just trying to treat the other person as a computer game or an object or buttons to press here and there. And you're not lost in the moment with somebody that you love. And there's no pauses and laughter and talking and all that stuff because you haven't worked that out yet. And that, I think, doesn't get talked about enough. And I think through researching and writing the porn book, that is my major worry for all those people who have never and will never engage a prostitute or engage in prostitution. When it comes to the sex love thing, they are getting that grooming through porn and they are losing the ability to perform. Rates of erectile dysfunction have gone up for young men from between 1% to 2%, which is quite steady all the way from World War II to the arrival of tube sites. Now they're anywhere between 25 and 30%. You have young men who are having sex with their girlfriends, and it's quite obvious that they can't come unless they are imagining scenes from porn, or they're getting their girlfriends to reenact stuff from porn because they can't finish without a certain way. And I say this in a very scientific way. Young men are falling in love with porn. They actually literally are falling in love with it because when you have an orgasm, you're releasing oxytocin and other chemicals, the same things that mothers release that makes them bond with their newborn child. If you masturbate to internet porn, you'll have the same chemical, you will actually bond with it. And if you're bonding with that, then you're not going to be bonding with the lover or partner in your life. And that's what I'm really terrified of.
Yeah, and that's really frightening. There's also books on that, like He Chose Porn Over Me, which is a good book to read.
Yeah, that's a really good book. Really good.
Yeah, and we can pop that in the notes as well. But there's also Nicholas Timberger's concept of supernormal stimuli. This isn't something that they'd encounter in real life. And it's so basically the porn encourages you not to feel shame and also increases the novelty value. And you have to keep adding more and more supernormal stimuli in order to get the same high.
Yeah.
And it really does prime men for dehumanization and objectification because all they're seeing is tons of women in a digital harem to do things to, rather than seeing them as someone to fall in love with. And this kind of stuff, like the really sadistic porn, once you get deep into the novelty value of this stuff, a good few recovering porn addicts have talked about this, it can turn pro-social men antisocial.
Yes.
Because if you're constantly looking at women being dehumanized, degraded, abused, spat on, urinated on, even worse, then you're not going to see their humanity. Your entire sexual template is going to be seen as something that's deeply antisocial, and you're going to be groomed to believe the women enjoy it.
Very much so. I'm really glad that you've brought up the point of novelty. There's been a very famous experiment, which I believe has been repeated many times, where you take a male and a female rat, you put them together, the male will mate vigorously with the female until he's completely shagged out, can't have sex anymore. The researchers take the female out and they put a fresh female in, and the male will again get all his energy back, and again he'll start humping. Males of mammals across many species crave this novelty. The equivalent experiment with men is to show men the same pornographic film more than a dozen times and you measure their arousal, and once you've seen it for the 12th or 13th time, then you're getting practically nothing. If you show a fresh scene, then immediately the arousal skyrockets. What a lot of people might not know is that pornography is not a service that you log on to, you use it, you do your business almost as if you're using the loo, say. It's not about getting rid of an urge, it's about cultivating that urge and keeping it on as long as you can. So there are stories, if you read the literature of the first person accounts, people who say that they're addicted to it, they talk about staying up all night. They lose their jobs because they stay up all night searching for the perfect piece of porn because they want to keep their brain in that arousal state for as long as they can. Now, what that must be doing in terms of how they view in real life the human beings that they see portrayed, it must be like staring at the sun for hours on end. It just must burn out, as you referred to earlier, any empathy receptors or ability to love and cherish.
Essentially, this is an addiction model. And if you are escalating and your addiction is growing and growing, like any other addiction, whether it's alcohol, whether it's drugs, everything else is just dwarfed in comparison. And all you'll get is just a craving for more and more things. And this is where gooning came from. The fact that there are so many men just addicted to it now that they will go into these weekend-long or week-long borderline meditative states where they're constantly edging themselves, trying to get the perfect hypersexual mind state to the point where they finally orgasm. But the whole idea is to not orgasm for as long as humanly possible and expose yourself to as much content as possible. And that's how bad it's getting. And when that's your entire weekend activity, when that's you've dwarfed everything else and you're going to the most extreme content, there is no capacity left there for love. There's no capacity left there for empathy. There's no capacity left there for probably even post-nut clarity at that point, which would be you orgasm and go, oh my God, what have I done? I think it gets to the point where I don't think there's any shame left in gooners. Even the shame circuits, if there is such a thing, are just going to be burned out. And I think it's got to the point as well where you're not even allowed to say anything is shameful. It's don't yuck somebody's yum still. And so they'll engage in really extreme content and be even in these communities that prop each other up, whether it's on FetLife, Column Me, whether it's on any Gooner Discord servers, things like that. And they will just say, oh, anything goes. It's not shameful to them. There's no shame from an internal source. Nothing. They want to get the next fix because their entire life can then revolve around getting this next fix in this digital harem. I don't think you can feel shame fully until you're recovered from that mind state. And it's so addictive, especially with the hypno stuff now as well. I wonder if they will ever get to that shame state.
I'm very interested and pleased that you have brought shame up. In the course of our research, I spoke to lots of people, including sex therapists and psychologists and marriage counselors too. And I brought up my idea that part of the solution to the pornography crisis, to the epidemic, is laws and restrictions and sort of fines and taxes and so forth. I imagine are all very important parts of it. But I think fundamentally, with something of this magnitude, something that can't be stamped out because it was already inextricably woven within the fabric of society, with kids growing up with porn, that there is no solution to it. Pornography is something we have to live with, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept those who actually use it. And one of the reasons pornography has been allowed to triumph is because the phrase that you use, don't yuck someone's yum, is that the concept of shame has been shamed itself. So do you see shame as a positive force? Because some of the people I've spoken to say you have to be very careful with encouraging people to feel feelings of shame because it will drive them further into their addiction. They might give up and they think, oh, I'm a worthless person. What's the point of trying to get better? Now, I'm not completely convinced by that, but what I clearly think that shame has an important role to play here.
I think there are different types of shame. There are the social policing aspects of shame that can only go so far. The thing I'm interested in is revelatory shame. And you need to create an environment whereby revelatory shame can actually happen. So we need to, along with Culture Reframed, start changing the conversation around pornography and actually look at the harms and look at the long-term consequences of it and start getting that out into the cultural water. So it basically paves the way for revelatory shame. So if someone is engaging in this stuff on the weekend and their relationships are suffering, their work is suffering, their life is suffering, if they're still goaded on by the Discord servers they're part of, they're not going to feel revelatory shame because they have a virtual social friend base who have the same malignant hobby.
And we're all self-reinforcing, which we see very much in the new online communities that have sprung up ever since sort of Tumblr and Reddit and so forth. And I think gender ideology is a prime example of that. I was talking about children growing up in sort of Harry Potter land where they make up their own rules and then they go to public school. And again, it's like Lord of the Flies. But there were always adults around to make sure that it didn't go too far, that we didn't start to cut each other's heads off and so forth. But kids growing up today, they don't have to go to a big old public school to have that sort of scenario of growing up without adults. I think all kids are doing that now, but in communities of their own choosing too. And so whereas 20 years ago we would have been goths and punks or whatever, but we still had to go home for our tea and still had to spend 100% of our life in the real world. Now you have people spending 60, 70% in these groups that constantly affirm each other. You're valid, your behavior is normal, you're one of us. Shame on you if you leave the tribe, all these things. And I think it leads to, this is the Lord of the Flies of our time, when kids are growing up with the bare minimum of parental or guardian supervision. And we're starting to see the results now.
I agree. And also, if you look at a lot of Gen Alpha behavior, it's already showing the signs of an intense technology addiction. So if you look at the children who are raised on iPads, they are screaming when those iPads are taken away. They're breaking chairs. They're not able to behave themselves in class. So already we have terrible attention spans, this kind of techno-barbarism, if you like, this neo-savagery where they're Lord of the Flying each other. And you have this whole problem where they're being made essentially ungovernable. And that is really terrifying for the fabric of society, especially if it comes to looking at hypersexualized content online, to the point now that Gen Alpha are autosexualizing themselves and giving AI generated child sexual abuse material to predators online using their own faces. And this is the coalface level of how bad this technology is right now. And I think it's only going to get worse, especially because now all of the social protocols around what's appropriate for children, what's appropriate for adults, having a gradual introduction, age appropriate in terms of sex and sexuality and puberty and things, they're all out the window. We're already in this Black Mirror world where we're just dealing with these consequences now. There needs to be a cultural reckoning, and there needs to be not just tighter restrictions, but there needs to be a real actual criminal reckoning for people who are making this pornographic content that they're looking at, which is clearly illegal. B, the actual structure of how we're using technology needs to be rearranged. This could be the first generation lost to the malignancies of technology, because they are in their formative years right now, just becoming these narcissistic neo-savages, these techno-barbarists. And I do think some of them had their heads screwed on, but the ones that don't, really don't. I don't know where we go from here. Dread to think how bad the next generation is going to have it if this is how bad Generation Alpha has it now.
You mentioned during your introduction that my day job is writing about tech, usually financial tech, but not exclusively. Everything these days is AI, just like everything 50 years ago was cloud. So I do see the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. And it scares me because the whole job of AI is to chip away at what it means to be human. People talk about, technology, Google wants to steal your data. It wants to make money out of your data. And as I think her name is Shoshana Zuboff in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which I would recommend to anyone, she makes the point that this isn't quite true. This was written before the AI boom, in that big tech and big corporates, they don't want to steal your data. They want to steal your emotions, your reactions. It wants to commodify what you like and dislike, and it wants to do this to edge you towards what they want to do, which could be toward buying a product, is the very obvious one and is quite a comparatively benign one. But technology is trying to very softly limit our sphere of action and our ability to exercise our own will. I'm afraid I'm not very good at condensing a fantastic 500-page book, and I haven't done a very good job there, but still I would urge anyone to read it. I always try and keep my counsel because it's such a midwit thing. It's such a sort of chattering class thing to say, technology is ruining things because, you're just middle-aged. It's become such a boring thing to say and such an unfashionably uninsightful thing to say that it hides the truth.
In terms of the tech thing, I would say one of the things that it does is also it changes our sphere of influence. And that's actually quite terrifying. If you look at people being influencers or doing things of influence, instead of us doing something that's politically engaging, we're selling products and becoming hypersexualized. And a lot of women, especially younger women and some younger men, when they want to be influencers, it's all about selling their body. And then they can end up in bop houses. They can end up, which is essentially OnlyFans version of Playboy Mansions, if you like, where they all get together and they all rent out a big space and they all do pornographic content together. So then you've got this technological grooming process where it's been so normalized that, especially for the young men doing it as well, they're seen as, oh yeah, you're such a stud, you're having sex with all these women. It's, well, those men can age out as well. Those men can be abused too. There's going to be a psychological toll on these men once they age out of their OnlyFans bracket and they realize that they've basically participated in something which is going to be online forever, which is not actually something that was fulfilling, which got them money but didn't actually give them anything else. And now that's going to be basically indelible because the internet is forever. That all can happen just from Instagram and TikTok because that's how these predatory companies actually recruit young guys and girls. And I think it's really sad.
No, for sure. And it's one of the things I'm very grateful for is when I was born. Depending on how you count, I'm either very youngest Generation X or the very oldest Generation Y. Some people call people like us cuspers because we were born not only on the cusp between X and Y, but we can also remember what life was like before the web. And I think that's so important. And while the internet swam into my life when I was about 15, when it was dial-up and no content on the internet, apart from porn. Porn was already huge on the web before most websites that we know, even newspapers had their own web page. But that also meant that I did most of my terrible, embarrassing things before there was a permanent record of it. I'm sure that there's somebody who's got some old 5-inch by 3-inch photos of me in compromising positions, passed out drunk or whatever. But I managed to get that out of my system before everybody had a high quality megapixel movie and editing studio in their pocket and the ability to publish it to millions of people within 1 second. And I can't imagine what that's like. For example, I don't want to single out any one person. She's not the only person doing this, but Lily Phillips, for example, not just to have the act of mass abuse against her out there recorded forever, but everything that she's recorded in the run up to it. And I'm not just talking about her own personal content, but I'm talking about the testimony of her when she set up her OnlyFans. The first people to sign up to it were her father's friends.
Oh my God.
And this was mentioned as if it wasn't exceedingly creepy and dark, and a betrayal of when your friends have daughters or sons, they are a new human being in your life. You have a relationship with them from the day that they are born. You have some sort of guardian function because they're your mate's kids.
Yeah.
And it just makes you think that all the way through this, I don't know, separating this from Lily, say, but how can you sign up to watch pornographic content of somebody you've known since they were a child and not have sexualized them in your mind before that? And at what age? When they started to develop sexually, when they began to get breasts, or before that? It just raises so many questions. I know that we've gone off topic here. It just shows how baffling, bamboozling, all encompassing this is, and how it's all very well to say tech is not the problem. Tech is not good or evil, it's how we use it. I would say, no, I'm sorry. If you have something that is rampaging so fast, we cannot even comprehend how society would change when we were able to talk to other people on the other side of the world in real time through chat. I remember sort of 1995, Windows 95. I'm sending an email to my grandson in Australia. I wonder what time it'll arrive, and all that. In some respects, we're still trying to get to grips with the idea of a networked world. And technology has gone through iteration after iteration. The latest one is AI. What's next? Humans are like geological timescales behind the evolution of tech, and that's not going to stop. So yeah, that does worry me, not just in terms of our sexuality, but our just relationships between human beings and tech, human beings and work. I must admit, I'm terrified, but I think pornography and prostitution are very useful ways to see where the harms are emerging. And I think it's so important that we do study this with a sort of a tech mindset.
No, absolutely. And one of the side things I was thinking is that if you're engaging in anything like this, if you've engaged in porn or prostitution prior to the dawn of the internet proper, then you have some kind of saving grace in moving on because it's not online. Say, for example, you have a very strong opinion about something and you change your mind. It's going to be easier to do that when you don't have a following dedicated to the thing you've just changed your mind about. So you've got this whole thing now where if you want to reinvent yourself, or if you want to go, actually, no, this isn't for me, you stand to lose so much. Because it isn't just like changing an opinion prior to the dawn of the internet. Lily Phillips, if she suddenly wakes up one day and goes, actually, this isn't for me, she loses millions. She has so much at stake that she's locked in now. And it's the same with anyone who's engaging in online prostitution, webcamming, OnlyFans, bop houses, anything like that. And I think that's one of the problems with technology is that, especially if you have a following, it uses the human social connectivity, if you like, against the person making the content if they ever want to leave, because you've created this very malignant tribe that's based on getting your content.
Yes. And the big question, one that I imagine that people like Lily and many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands or more have to grapple with, and which we have no idea how to do because we've never encountered this in human history, is how one goes from the billion to the one, from basing your entire life and your entire worth, your entire being around having millions of people follow you and getting your self-esteem, self-respect, sense of self-worth, your identity, your money, your income from masses of faceless people you won't meet, to finding that connection with the one person that you want to spend the rest of your life with, and that you can be completely emotionally and physically naked with, and at peace and serenity, and to enjoy the ecstasy of sex, your love. It could take a whole lifetime and it might never come, but we're talking about that figuration happening not just to one person but to all those engaged in this. As I say, it's quite hard for the human mind to comprehend that challenge on an individual level, let alone at population scale.
Very true. And I also think as well, one of the saddest things, I saw the Lily Phillips documentary, and one of the saddest things she said was, well, if I want somebody, they're going to have to be okay with lending me out.
Yeah.
She couldn't conceive of just being with someone and just being in love. And I just wonder how many quote unquote OnlyFans performers or people doing webcam stuff or being in bop houses, how many performers feel that way? That's just all they can think of, that, oh, someone's going to have to be okay with lending me out, rather than them actually being okay with just having a proper loving relationship.
This might seem a bit pathetic to go from porn and sex to the more everyday world of work, but you've got to remember that this doesn't just affect one's relationships and sexuality.
Yeah.
It'll affect your relationships at work, say. You become the worker who wants to please the boss and do late nights and take all sorts of shit jobs because you're the person who is put on earth to give pleasure and meaning to others, and that's how you actually get your meeting. It can be how you have your interactions. You can base entire friendships upon, I'm the friend who gets dumped on, who gets emotionally used, and I'm a doormat and a carpet and so forth. So I think we've got to see it. Obviously, sex and relationships is a huge part of life, but we have to see it in its entirety too.
Yes, 100%. Again, that brings up the grooming model again, where if all you're doing is just aiming to please. And that has parallels with another woman I was friends with in the BDSM scene, where she was so indoctrinated into being in quote unquote sub mode, and she was in a highly misogynistic work environment, and she'd say things like, I said this in my previous thing actually with the BDSM episode with Ellie, oh, I just go into sub mode at work and I can bear it. And when she said that to me, it just broke me. So you are going into a quote unquote real life work situation and you are being treated as subhuman because you've been trained that as long as you go in sub mode, that's going to be fine, you can bear it, and that's somehow okay. And that's not something for HR, that's not something that you need to challenge, that your humanity isn't considered, that you just have to go in sub mode. And I thought that was just devastating. We're moving on to the final questions now. So, playing devil's advocate for a second, what if all porn was ethical?
Well, I think I would have to ask you to define what you mean by ethical first.
Okay, so to my mind, ethical pornography would be something where no one was coerced into it. No one had a power differential over the other person. There was no trafficking, no force, no rape, no sexual violence, and everyone was there of their own free will and gaining genuine sexual pleasure from the acts entailed.
Okay, well, that definition is pretty close to what I've got in my own notes. So I've got no coercion, physical, emotional, psychological, financial, and you'd have to find out all these things. You'd have to make sure that these were all true and that the performer wasn't lying. And again, going back to the acting element of when I was in Prostitution, I was a very good actor, and that means being a very good liar too. So I think there's lots of problems there. I think there's also problems with the content itself, and there's serious questions there about where does prudery end and abuse start?
Yes.
If it's all consensual, say, then is it ethical to have spitting, strangulation, consensual non-consent, pseudo-child porn, where the actress is dolled up in pigtails and given freckles and given props like a lollipop, or is told to reenact a scenario where her uncle abuses her, say, which happens a distressingly large amount of time in modern porn. I think incest is one of the fastest growing categories in porn. Perhaps it's not anymore because it's reached incest. So I think I wouldn't even say thorny ethical questions, but there are questions about what the content depicts too, and who is the arbiter of what is safe sex, safe porn. I think in theory, it could be possible to produce porn in a way that is ethical towards the performers. But the way I come at things is I'm a man. I try to be as supportive as I can towards women, but I'm very conscious I'm not one, and I can only give that support from the outside. But I'm also team men. I really care about men, and I think we are in huge crisis now, and I want what's good for my team. And I don't see how anything that takes men away from the ability to connect with the object of what should be the object of their love is a good thing. I don't think anything that makes men bond with pixels on the screen rather than flesh and blood human is good either. I don't think anything that causes huge rates of erectile dysfunction, I don't think that's an ethical thing to produce for men. To leave women out of the question entirely. So I think from that perspective, no, I don't. Shall I say, I'm yet to be convinced that porn can be ethical. And this leads me on to a question that I've been turning over in my mind for some time. There's no shortage of people who will defend the porn industry, who will claim that pornography is not addictive and so forth. And it's all pretty bogus. Any other sort of substance that is accepted within society? Alcohol is a particularly good example. Causes a huge amount of harms and family breakups, violence against women, people losing their jobs, suicides and so forth. But that tends to affect a part of the population, whereas others get on very well with it, and they can put a cork in the bottle and they enjoy a nice glass of wine. It really adds to human society, and it's the lubricant of conversation, and entire cultures grow up around food and wine and so forth. There is undeniably a very good side to booze. I've yet to hear people who defend pornography say anything convincing about how it's good in any way.
Yeah, to my mind, with the whole ethical porn thing, I think that actually there's a difference between pornography and the possibility of good erotic content, which is rehumanizing, can bring people together, is sensuality focused. Again, there's no coercion and there's no power differential. And there used to be a very small microcosm. This is obviously not aimed at men, but there was a magazine ages ago called Filament magazine, which is set up to be the antithesis of Playboy. And it was for the women who liked hot men and intelligent thought. And it was a huge variety of men, different scenarios, some fantasy scenarios, which were immersive, all different body types, non-exploitative, was not done for profit, so nobody was paid. And I think the reason it finished was because the woman just got really tired of looking at it all the time and just wanted to raise chickens. I think that there's been teeny tiny specks of light in a vast swathe of darkness, but they're very few and far between, and they have a tendency not to last for whatever reason. Because also you're battling this commercial behemoth as well, where it's to do with money and churning out as much content as possible. And with the onset of AI pornography, you can churn out an infinite amount of highly abusive content, which can be so addictive. It may be a possibility you will never be unaddicted in your life. I think even if there was something that was genuinely good, holistic, body pleasure, erotic content, I don't know how much it would even be able to compete with the abusive porn industry. It's people being shown fruit and veg for the first time when they've had a diet of McDonald's for their entire life. They're not going to be inclined to pick up a fucking apple before they've had a French fries. So I think there's another problem there with how do you poison the well with pornography and get people to go, oh, actually, this isn't actually good for me. I want something more ethical. I want something where people aren't being hurt or abused. I also wonder if there's people who understand how abusive the porn industry is because they are so good at covering their tracks that most of the people, even in BDSM groups and things, they didn't even know that the stuff on Pornhub, for example, which was labeled as C&C, was actual rape. They had no idea. They were clueless. So the conversation needs to be more. We need to ring the alarm about how genuinely unethical and abusive the pornography industry is, and then get people to realize, oh shit, these are actual human beings that are suffering. And if you can't rehumanize people who've been at the coalface of this abuse, I think that's where we're going to be in real problem with our humanity. And so I think that's the angle we need to go from, rather than can we make ethical porn? I think it's ringing the alarm and actually presenting, if there's a possibility of presenting a genuine alternative. But I think that's very far off, if I'm honest.
And I think one thing that I would add to that is that sadly it's become everybody's responsibility. I think it's important not to talk about porn in terms of how can we get the users to stop or to watch less.
Yeah, it's the pornographers proper who need to bear the brunt.
Yes, who need to bear the brunt of perhaps regulation and prosecution. But I need to phrase this quite carefully, not to make out that I'm putting responsibility on strangers and on women as sex class, but unfortunately, pornography has become everybody's problem, even if they don't watch it. It's become parents' problem. It's become the problem of any woman who wants to have a relationship with a man now. I'm not telling women what to do, but it seems if women want to have a good and fulfilling relationship, it might be that they have to make it very clear that there is going to be no porn in their relationship at all. And if she finds out that her man has viewed it, that they should treat it as an addiction like any other. Oh, it's just one drink, it's just one beer. No, I'm afraid you're an alcoholic. I'm afraid you've broken the deals of our relationship, and just run. Far be it from me to tell people that's what they should do. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to be really careful. I'm trying not to say, women, you should do this. But what I'm trying to get across is the fact that this might have to be a consideration for any young female adult approaching adulthood, that people are going to have to learn to have boundaries around their partner's porn use, in that there must be none at all, because the consequences are you might end up marrying somebody who just isn't there. Who isn't there in bed, who isn't there in the relationship.
I think that's an interesting premise. And I do think having that as a deal breaker to start off with when they start dating is a good idea. I think there's another YouTuber called Cataclysm who I'm quite fond of, who talks about this and talks about, actually, no, you should make sure that there's no porn in the relationship. The other problem you've got, though, is that men generally are physically bigger and stronger than women. And if you are in a relationship that already has some negative tendencies or qualities and you're not able to immediately get out, and they're also using porn, I don't think you can necessarily then place the onus on the woman to say, actually, no, I've had enough and I'm going to leave, because that's not the way abusive relationships work. You have to plan an exit strategy. I would be cautious about saying, especially if you're in that particular situation, I'd be cautious about saying something like that. But I would say at the start of dating, put it on the table and say, actually, yeah, this is my hard limit. This is my deal breaker, by the way. I just don't think pornography is a good idea and I don't want it in the relationship. So from the offset, fine. If you're in an abusive relationship where pornography is prevalent, then that's going to be a different strategy. That's going to have to be a different game plan where you have to plan your exit carefully. So moving on to the final questions. What do you envisage being positive changes we could make in society?
I've given this quite a lot of thought, as you can imagine. I would say that the way the question's framed, it's looking down the wrong end of the telescope. Obviously, pornography is an epidemic at global societal scale, but that's not to say that I see the answer as being in a top-down fashion as a matter of governments or legislation or the courts.
Our final question: how can we reframe culture to view the realities of both porn and prostitution?
I suppose the way I think about it is, what would you do if you were at work and a colleague told you a racist joke, or you overheard someone saying something racist? I think you and I both would, at the very least, we would signal that we disapproved. And I'm a big believer in the really small things like that. And again, going back to our book, we give the example when we approach this question of somebody who shouts racial abuse at a football match. And the reason why people don't, and the reason why we have largely stamped out the racism of the sort of 1970s and 1980s from the football terrorists, is the power of conforming. It's the fear of being on the outside of the tribe, of being ostracized, of having that disapproval cast at you. And again, I don't want to make light of things like laws and regulations and prosecutions relating to prostitution and porn. I think all these are incredibly important parts of the jigsaw. I don't think that laws change who we are. I think, going back to your fantastic phrase, I wish we'd have had this conversation a few weeks earlier, because I could have stolen it and put it into our draft.
Yeah.
I don't think laws alone, or I don't think external forces on their own, are enough to bring someone to that point where they realize for themselves that what they're doing is harmful to them and others. And I'm a big believer that most individuals do have the capacity to change. And I think the type of shame that you're talking about is a huge part of that. So I think when you say, how do we reframe culture to view the actual realities, I think one of the most important starting points of that is to be able to express shame without feeling shamed for doing so.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm hoping as well that men are going to be more likely to feel that revelatory shame in the future, because I think that's one of the things that's going to help them be on the road to recovery when it comes to not just porn use, but also bleeds into the behavior in real life. It bleeds into how they treat women. It bleeds into how they treat people around them. So yeah, I'm hoping that revelatory shame will eventually become a catalyst for some actual change. So on that note, thank you so much for being here. It's been just eye-opening and a pleasure, and you're welcome back with us at any time. Thank you so much for being here, Rob.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.